we got hit with an absolute insane amount of snow overnight in Toronto. I know it's snowshoeing because I thought that'd be a good idea for some reason, and there's at least 1 foot and 2 feet of snow in some areas. Everything is just completely white. Speaking of white, I thought this would be a good opportunity to actually explain what white balance is when editing your photos. If your photo is too blue or too yellow, there's a good chance you have a white balance problem. Most of the time I like to keep my camera set to auto white balance, but the camera doesn't always get it right.
Here's what I mean. This photo was shot early in the morning, and because there are really tall buildings off to the right of the photo, this whole plaza in front of Toronto City Hall ends up being in shade. As a result, the photo looks very blue. Now I can take the auto white balance setting, which is as shot right here, that is as my camera determined it. I can set it to auto, or I can also set it to shade, and that's Lightroom's interpretation of anything that is in shade. Of course, I could also go in here and drag it left and right. I can go back to where I started so that it looks more blue, or I can take it really far and go really yellow. But the problem is when I take it really far, I start to remove some of the other colors that I want to see in my image. You can see that the flag it's maybe still a little bit red, but I've removed any hints of blue in the sky. On the other hand, if I go all the way to the left, now this photo is completely blue and I have almost no color and no room to edit this photo. Now, of course, everyone's gonna have their own creative interpretation of how they want their photos to look. One of the best ways to really nail your photo is, of course, to shoot in manual. That way you can see the image in real time and see it on your camera and see if what you remember in real life is exactly what it looks like on your camera. Let's take this one step deeper though and try to actually understand what's happening when we're adjusting white balance. White balance has 2 settings, color temperature and tint. Color temperature is measured in degrees Kelvin, which is actually a measure of temperature that was invented by this guy, a British scientist known as William Kelvin. His idea was that if you took a pure black object, or in science what is known as a black body radiator, and slowly heat it up, by the time it reached 2000 Kelvin, it would start to turn red, then it would turn yellow, and as it got hotter to around 5000 Kelvin, it would turn white, and then slowly as you went to 6, 7, 8, 9000 degrees Kelvin, it would turn blue. All of those temperatures are captured in the settings that are contained within your camera. Now this only tells half of the story because we also have tint. Tint is a measure of green to magenta. Think of it as a gradient. When you take both the color temperature gradient and the tint gradient and overlay them, you essentially have an infinite range of colors where you can set your white balance. An easy way to do this is if you have either a point in your photo that you know is supposed to be white, or what they call a gray card or a color reference card. Then you can come in here, you can pick this little white balance tool and then click on a point in your image that you think should be white. Now again, the auto setting doesn't always work, and sometimes you need to use your creative interpretation to actually get the photo the way you want to look. A common myth about white balance is that it affects your raw files and the way your camera takes an exposure. Here's what I mean. This is a photo of a wizard. Actually, wrong photo. This is a photo of a wizard. This was taken with the daylight setting on my camera. I took 2 other versions of this photo. One with a wrong white balance where it was too warm, and another with a cool white balance where it was way too cool. If I take this photo and adjust it to the daylight setting within Lightroom, which would be correct white balance, and take this second photo and set it to daylight, and now I go back and forth between the 2 of them, you can see, other than some ice melting up in front, the photos are identical. Both of these photos are identical exposures, and the data, because it's a 12-bit raw file, remains completely intact. Now, a sidebar here is if you're doing video and you're shooting either 8-bit or 10-bit color, that's where getting your white balance set correctly is going to be extremely important, because you can't change it afterwards. Now, if you're shooting with a cinema camera and you're shooting in 12-bit RAW, you of course can change color temperature afterwards, but for the majority of us shooting videos with a DSLR or a camera phone or anything that doesn't have raw video, you're gonna wanna really nail your white balance in camera to start. Where white balance becomes a little bit tricky is when you have a mix of color temperatures in your image. With this photo, you can see that it's blue hour outside. The sun has set and the interior looks pretty well white, but the exterior is too blue. If you were to grab your little color temperature picker and then pick a point outside the window, you would see it would balance for the exterior, and now the interior is just way too yellow. So I would always recommend grabbing it, setting it to a point on the interior so that it can correct for the blue and yellow, but also so that it can correct for the magenta and the green tint. Similarly with this photo, we have some of the blue washing towards the interior. What I'll do is I'll set my white balance for the interior, and then if you really want to remove that blue, you can go down to your HSL, hue and saturation, and if I turn that adjustment on, you can see that I've desaturated some of the blue, so there's not as much of that color coming through. If you want to know more about making hue and saturation adjustments, I have a full tutorial where I go in and kind of explain some of the ways I like to use this feature. Now with this photo, it's a little bit more challenging because we have really big exterior windows where that natural blue exterior light is flooding a bit more towards the interior. So if I was to drag my white balance a little bit more to the left, you can see there's more blue to the left side of the photo and more yellow to the right side of my photo where that's more interior and I have more of the artificial lights. So in some cases, you might have to be a little bit more flexible and not always rely on that color picker, but come in and kind of set that manually to how you want your photos to look. One additional thing about white balance is that you might notice it lives at the very top of the develop panel. Now this is intentional because both exposure and white balance are the two first adjustments you should make on any one of your photos. This is a photo where I've done all the editing in advance. Let's say I came back afterwards and wanted to adjust my white balance. If I drag it to the left, you notice that the trees, which are a really bright yellow, start to not only desaturate, but lose their luminance. Now that's because the way I edited this photo was to desaturate the greens, desaturate the blues, but then I boosted the luminance or the brightness of both the yellows and the oranges in this photo. So as I'm sliding my white balance more and more towards blue, those warm yellow tones start to disappear. They start to become more green and more blue, and then the integrity of my edit gets lost. Sliding down here, you can see exactly what I mean. I've desaturated the greens, I've desaturated the blues, I've actually desaturated the yellows because I pushed them more towards orange, but if I jump in here towards luminance, you can see I've boosted my yellows, I've boosted the brightness of my oranges to really give my photo, those trees and the cottage there, a lot more contrast. Be very careful when you go in and you make white balance adjustments after. You may find it very hard to get the effect you want. Always make your white balance adjustments first. Completely changing what I said, you can also go back and make white balance adjustments after if you want to do slight adjustments to the color in your image. For example, this photo I edited so the sky kind of looked like cotton candy, where you have like a pinky orange and then you have a little bit of blue in the shadows in the sky. But say maybe I made this edit and I thought, no, I really do want it to be a little bit warmer, or maybe I want to remove some of the blue. If I took that slider and just bumped it ever so slightly, you can see the integrity of the photo remains intact, but I am just removing a little bit of blue in those clouds. A common mistake I'll see is that people will say, here's how to warm up your image. Maybe they're doing wedding photos or some sort of styled edit, and they'll take the white balance and just slide it all the way so that it appears to be more warm. Again, the problem with this is that you're ruining the integrity of the colors in your image. Now, another way to warm up your image is, of course, using something like color grading, but I always reserve that to be my very final edit because there are other ways that are more flexible to push and pull the colors in your image, specifically using the tone curve adjustments. Now, the biggest takeaway out of all of this is whether you shoot in manual white balance mode or you're like me and sometimes you feel a little bit lazy and you just leave your camera in automatic, white balance does not permanently alter alter your photo. As long as you shoot in RAW, you can always go back and make those adjustments afterwards. So how do you use white balance? Are you fully automatic? Are you fully manual? Go ahead and leave a comment. Or if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more Lightroom tutorial photography content, consider subscribing. I've got a ton more Lightroom editing tutorials and photography stories coming up in the future that you'll definitely want to stick around for. And if you do, I'll see you in the next one.